And hello, may the 4th be with you. Yes, it's Byline Times Live, covering the mayoral and council elections with me, co-founder of Byline Times, Peter Jukes.
And me, Hardeep Matharu, I'm the editor of Byline Times.
And me, Adam Bienkov, political editor of Byline Times.
And me, Josiah Mortimer, chief reporter at Byline Times.
So I will confess, there's no cameras. It's probably a good thing there's no cameras at the moment, because we have opened some Prosecco and beer. Why? Well, it's Saturday, we can take a bit of time off, and also we're celebrating. We're not celebrating any victory of any party, no. And as we'll explain, what we're celebrating is the apparent triumph of democracy over voter suppression, disinformation, lies, and attempts to deceive the electorate. Hardeep, we'll be doing more of this, won't we? This is a dry run for something bigger coming very soon.
Yes. I mean, Peter, we've missed it, haven't we? We've missed talking to our readers and our supporters and everybody who loves Byline Times and what we do. Obviously, we had our Friday shows, which we love doing. But
2 years, 100 shows.
We've been away for a while. But yes, in the run-up to the general election, we will be making these podcasts and studio recordings a regular occurrence, because it's a really important year, not just here in the UK, but obviously all over the world. And not just for elections, but for democracy itself.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some democracy. Let's go to our political editor, Adam, first. I'll just say, by the way, this is all funded by your subscriptions to Byline Times, our monthly newspaper, found in all good shops now since we stopped the CV show. Adam is our political editor and great to read, and just our chief correspondent. Adam, what do you make of it so far, the last day or so?
Well, I think whenever there's a set of local elections, you never get an entirely consistent, universal picture. But I think compared to most local elections, there's a pretty clear theme here, which is the Conservatives right across the country in all types of seats, rural areas, metropolitan areas, have got a complete thumping. Of course, there's always going to be some exceptions, and there are parts of the country where the Conservatives did less badly than in other parts of the country. Some of the swings against the party in some of their mayoral seats have been lower. In London, Sadiq Khan did win, but by less of a swing than in some other parts of the country that Labour have seen. So it's not a complete universal picture, but it's undoubtedly the case that the main picture that is painted from these elections is that the opinion polls that we've been seeing over the last year are broadly right. The Conservatives are on course for a historic defeat in the next general election, and nothing that the Conservative Party has done since Rishi Sunak took over as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party seems to be turning things around for them.
We'll go into some more detail on that, on some of those policies, which don't seem to have gone down well. I love the way you put it, they've done less badly and direly in some places, less badly in others. But what were we doing here, because we are what the papers don't say, is looking at how some of this has been covered, how some of the spin, the focus on some parts is the expense of others, and whether we're seeing the true picture through the lens of our rather monopolised media. On the ground, and there's a great column every month called On the Ground, written by Josiah Mortimer. Josiah's been around the country doing a lot of reporting, looking at things, and we've been conducting a rather wonderful project, which you kind of led, Josiah, which is called Vote Watch. Maybe explain the principles of that, and we'll come back and look at some more details of it.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And Vote Watch, funded by our good Byline Times readers, so thank you all who've chipped into that. A project really to follow dodgy donations, disinformation, and general downright dastardly campaigning.
So you've been busy.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot. I think maybe slightly bit off more than we could chew. No, we've had some great freelance reporters come in as well. And as you said before, it has been a bit of a dry run, I think, for a general election. We've seen some really pretty bad campaigning, to be honest, in the run-up to these local elections. We've seen trends like certain parties issuing fake newspapers, pretending to be other parties. We saw that a lot with Conservatives seeming to abandon their name, abandon their party branding, their party colour on many of their leaflets, issuing these fake newspapers that were almost fully read in many places. We've seen, obviously, the rollout of mandatory voter ID as well, and a lot of concern that many voters would be disenfranchised by that. And actually, we have seen that play out. And perhaps most comically, I think, with Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, being turned away.
There was some beautiful joke. He gerrymandered himself and said, Adam, anybody can find it, by the way, if you go to Adam's handle on Twitter, X, and there you asked Boris Johnson about voter ID. Can you remember what you said and what his reply?
I put it to him, this was during the COVID period and we were all in lockdown. I I had the opportunity to put a question to him, and I decided to ask him about his plans for voter ID law. And I suggested to him that the research suggested that this was more likely to affect Labour voters. And what was his response to the suggestion that this was about suppressing the vote against his political opponents? And he would completely dismiss it and described it as complete nonsense.
Complete nonsense. But he went and suppressed himself.
Indeed, but I think this kind of ties in with the theme of these elections. I think the Conservative Party under Rishi Sunak had a chance to turn themselves around from the disaster of the Johnson and the Truss era and to win back the trust of the British public and to change their agenda so it more meets the centre ground of British public opinion. And instead of doing that, they've tried to do things like introducing voter ID law, changing the voting system in London, all these kinds of essentially what are just kind of tricks to try and...
Changing it so you no longer have second preferences is the one.
Tricks to win the general election, rather than actually trying to change what they're offering the country. And I think we've seen that as well in the way that they've responded to these results. So I think the Conservatives had a chance after these results. I think the thing you normally should do as a political party when you've had a thumping, as they clearly have, is say, look, we understand you don't like us, we're going to change. This is how we're going to change, and we'll come back and we'll earn back your trust. And instead, their response has been to say, actually, it's better than it looks, and we're doing quite well here, and maybe we just keep on saying the same things a bit louder and louder. These naughty voters will decide that they've made a mistake and come back to us.
So we could go to some very good specifics on that with Susan Hall and the election in London. But you read a very good headline. It's actually the front page moment of Byline Times online, bylinetimes.com. Subscribe early. What's the headline about the culture wars?
In the run-up to these local elections, parties always want to be pushing their main messages. And I think the Conservative parties, the message they should have been pushing is about we bring down council tax, we try and run councils more efficiently.
Fight inflation.
Yeah, the sort of standard Conservative messages. But instead, in the run-up, we had the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, in the final hours of the campaign, going on to LBC to talk about gender-neutral toilets.
So you had a great phrase, flushing down the gender, what was the expression, headlights?
Flushing the culture war down the gender-neutral toilets. But again, it's a trick,
Yeah.
And the former Conservative Deputy Chairman Lee Anderson said, we don't have Boris Johnson anymore, we don't have Brexit, so we need to find something else to win the election. And it's going to be trans issues and the culture wars. Again, it's like the gerrymandering. It's just a trick to try and win the election rather than actually appealing to what voters actually care about, which, as we can see from these elections, is the economy, is the NHS, and is those kind of bread and butter issues.
Hadi, the polls show that this culture war, wedge issues, and we should add Islamophobia in there, especially with Suella Braverman saying terrorists on the street if they want to cease fire in Gaza. Why do you think this is happening? It's actually a theme, isn't it? Going to be our next print edition. And you relieve these culture wars on actually turning out anybody except GB News viewers and GB News pundits.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Peter? We were having some conversations with some academics and experts this week about the cruelty in politics that the Conservatives appear to be adopting, which goes hand in hand with the culture wars. So a lot of these issues, like the focus on the Rwanda scheme, the weaponization of the trans issue, the attacks on homeless people, renewed benefits cuts, people on disability benefits and the sick. Why are they doing this? Because it seems quite nasty. There doesn't seem to be any evidence-based policy to a lot of this stuff. And as Adam says, it doesn't go in any way towards fixing what is the priority for most people, which is the economy. But that's exactly why they're doing it, because you can't now, after 14 years, just suddenly pull something out of the bag and tell people that their incomes and their livelihoods are going to be significantly better. I mean, you can try and convince them of that, but if you've got nothing to back that up, there is nothing there, as Lee Anderson hinted to. So then you have to go to these issues. But I think it's actually backfiring, because it's not just mentioning these culturally emotive issues. There's a nastiness to it, which I think is coming through, a renewed sort of nasty party from the Conservatives. And I think that is cutting through with the public insofar as they're rejecting it. They don't want that. Not only is it not relevant, I think it doesn't meet the mood of the country. I think the country itself, after many years of austerity, COVID, the impacts of Brexit, I think people are in a really bad position. And I think people have some knowledge and empathy of other people who are struggling in society. And I think the combination of playing politics with democracy, introducing voter ID and all this stuff, combined with this cruelty and culture wars, they're not reading the mood of the country. And so I think that's really interesting for how that bodes for the general election.
So Adam has this great phrase for it, vice signalling, that you signal this cruelty, and I won't give away the headline of our next edition. A lot of this is taken from America and Liz Truss's great backers in the Heritage Foundation and Steve Bannon and things like that. And we spoke to this academic, we'll have it in the paper, like a political scientist, Brian Klass, who writes a brilliant Substack, almost as good as ours and Adam's. And he said two things, really, that does play in America, this kind of cruelty, because it's a socially more antagonistic environment. He's an American, lives in the UK, and is amazed, like during COVID, how people clap for carers. It's not that kind of civil society.
Polarized in the
yeah,
States.
and much more polarized. And I'm just wondering, Adam, that's a sort of miscalculation, the vice signaling they're doing, because your polling shows people don't like it here.
Yeah, I think it is a direct attempt to import the political culture from the US, and it isn't working. We did some polling this week on the planned changes to disability and welfare and to long-term sick. And a large majority, about around 3/4 of the population, oppose the changes that the government is implementing. And you see that on all of these kinds of issues. I think after 14 years of low growth, low wages, public services suffering, there is just not the public appetite for these kinds of vice signalling policies that possibly there was 14 years ago after the Labour government, and it just isn't there anymore.
Curtis says, doesn't he? There is a phase when services are good, public services, if they were, so 2010. The people go, we spend too much money on government, and they want not austerity, but less spent on services. And then there comes a point, less spent on services, and they want more.
It's a way to try and deflect the blame.
Right.
So the public blame the Conservative Party, they blame Liz Truss for putting up their mortgages. And so it's a way to say, no, don't blame us.
Blame a foreigner.
Blame these people blame asylum seekers, blame somebody sitting at home claiming benefit while I'm not going into work, blame young people, blame whoever, just don't blame us. And as we see from these local election results, the public just doesn't have an appetite for that anymore. They're not listening.
Kudos to the public desire. So another American tactic, which is voter ID, voter suppression. We saw this, Adam picked it up way back quizzing Boris Johnson on this in 2021. Just tell us some of your experiences on the ground and your freelancers of this quite sometimes invisible, but obviously scary voter suppression. One of the things people panicked, we'll come to London and some of the elect in detail soon, was that it might be effective, 2 or 3% here and there, people not see whether you think it was effective. Obviously, if it's big enough swing to Labour, it's not going to make that much difference. But what was your experience on the ground?
That's right, yeah. I mean, we don't yet know the true scale in raw numbers of how many people were affected by it, but we do know around 2 million people lack the so-called right photo ID in this country. And I was digging through some of the numbers on who's applied for this so-called free ID that the government are offering. And I think the maximum is something like 8 to 10% of people who don't have ID who've applied for that. So there is still a very big chunk of the country who could be really badly hit by this policy. And of course, while the numbers in a local election might be quite small, scale that up to a general election, we're talking about certainly tens of thousands of people.
Maybe more.
I thought could be much more. Could be hundreds of thousands. Yeah. But I mean, one of the issues that I think campaigners get really frustrated about is this is just another barrier really to people taking part in democracy. We already know we have around 8 million people who aren't even on the electoral roll altogether. So campaigners...
explain this. So how can somebody not be on the electoral roll?
Well, it's not automatic in this country. So much of Europe, if you're a citizen, you pay your council tax, you're automatically enrolled onto the electoral roll. In this country, we're quite unusual in that everyone has to individually, when they move house, they have to sign up to the electoral roll.
Other people do it. Why can't we make it mandatory?
It's very exceptional.
It's a very good question. There are often these concerns that therefore represent giant
state control,
state overreach, and a step towards ID cards. Well, I'm sorry, there's probably about 4,000 private companies that have far more information than what is needed to put your name on the electoral roll. And, of course, we've already got our details with the NHS. With
and you
DWP.
have to get ID to come now to vote. So the idea that it'd be an intrusion that you get automatically put on the electoral roll, it just makes no sense.
In a way, they've massively undercut their own argument on that, I think, in the last few years. So I think Labour, it's very likely they will move towards automatic voter registration.
So they're going, rather than overturn the voter ID thing, go a step further, which could, and obviously student cards as well. Because a lot of people, the papers do not report this very often. We were the first to lead on this 2 years ago. Adam asked the first question about it. If I will confess something here now, and not many people know this. I have an over 60s rail card, right? I can get on the I'm over 60. Nobody believes that. I know it's amazing, especially when it's sound only. And that's acceptable, isn't it? I can turn up, I actually use my driving license, with my TfL 60s rail card, yeah? But if I was a student rail card, no.
Yeah, there's lots of these bizarre anomalies. And actually, we've seen a lot of people justifiably complaining about the lack of acceptable IDs for young people in the ID list. Well, this past few days, we've seen things like army veterans and NHS staff their ID is not being accepted. Even press cards, which are issued by and accepted by police authorities in this country, people are being turned away for that. So I think it's sort of
Journalists, you don't want journalists voting. Come on.
Of course, we wouldn't vote anyway.
We're impartial.
Yeah, so I think it's really opened people's eyes a little bit just to how really shoddily this was rolled out. And I think before it was sort of a suspicion, really, that this was just a way of suppressing the votes. And I think there was a certain part of that. But I do think if that was the intention, it really could be backfiring.
I mean, this was what Jacob Rees-Mogg suggested, I think it was a year or so ago, is that he essentially admitted as a member of the Boris Johnson government that this was an attempt to suppress the vote. But
he called it incorrectly, he called it gerrymandering, which is moving. But he's not the smartest tool in the box,
we understood
is he?
What he was getting at. But he was saying that it was backfired and it was largely Conservative voters who were being affected. We don't know that's the case because we haven't got the data on that. But clearly, Conservative MPs are being affected.
Oh, there's a Conservative MP. But God, two.
And a former Conservative Prime Minister has been affected by it. So it's not clear that it has had that impact. But of course, we've seen what's happened in London. Sadiq Khan has won by 10 points. Had it been much closer, as they feared,
you could have put it down to that.
It could have come down to a handful of votes in a handful of constituencies. And for the sake of cutting down on a problem, in-person voter fraud, which is virtually non-existent.
There's one prosecution in 10 years or so, or 5 years.
So I think whether or not what the political intention of it was, it clearly is causing far more problems than they'd ever been caused by the previous situation in terms of people trying to steal the vote.
As part of our Vote Watch coverage, we've had a great run of stories. They're all available on our website, bylinetimes.com. So please do go and have a look at them, because Josiah, Adam, and a great set of freelance journalists have been reporting on various issues. But I think it was, for me, summed up in an article which got at some of the absurdities and inconsistencies of introducing a new policy from scratch, which is always going to have teething problems, to say the least. But again, this point about the problem it's meant to solve, stopping voter fraud. And we had this example of, ironically for us, in a nice way, a Telegraph columnist's wife who uses her maiden name and her marital name are different. And
as it often is.
As often happens. And they therefore didn't match, I think.
Oh, on the card or her ID.
And her ID.
Right.
And she was told by a polling station that they'd need to see her marriage certificate. And so she did. She went and got her marriage certificate. She came back and she was able to vote. But we managed to speak to her husband, the Telegraph columnist, who kind of summed it up with, it's just bonkers.
It's just bonkers.
And his wife was told when she went back to the polling station, she raised her concerns and they said, well, we're going to put those forward to the individual that's coming round to check on how this is all going today in terms of voter ID. And the official, when they found out, reportedly said, oh, another one. Which I think just was a great bit of simple on-the-ground journalism. In the same article, there was an example of another person who's at a completely different polling station with this same discrepancy between the marital name and the maiden name, but they were able to vote without their marriage certificate. So this is being applied inconsistently. It just seems like a very odd thing to introduce in the middle of everything.
It comes back to something broader. A problem with the government is that people don't expect much from politicians, but they do expect them to make their lives better and to make things easier. And not to actually create problems where there wasn't a problem in the first place.
Like Brexit border checks.
Exactly. And I think this is a real good example of where that's happened, where there wasn't really a significant problem with voter fraud. Where voter fraud does exist, it's been in postal voting. But that wasn't touched initially by this scheme. So it's just something that's made life harder for people. It's made more people disenfranchised. It's discouraged people from actually turning up to vote in the first
that's place. The thing. It's the deterrent effect. America is not that people turn up, get turned away. It's they think they'll get turned away, isn't it? And then we don't know.
Yeah, and it goes back to what Adam was saying about these cultural war currents coming in, or the attempts to bring them in from the United States. And again, voter suppression, the Johnson government, and certainly the ones afterwards, but the Johnson government, I think they were looking to America and looking at these tactics in terms of our democracy and what it is and changing it. And I think that is something of concern. I think it's good that we're highlighting it because it's not just about the state that the Conservatives are leading the country in after 14 years. It's a legacy of changing our democracy in these ways, playing politics with democracy, which you'd hope that would be solved perhaps by a new administration. But you don't know if that changes the political fabric more fundamentally.
Yeah, and I think another thing that illustrates that is so often when supporters of, for example, a change to proportional representation for voting in Westminster elections, they've always been told that's not a bread and butter issue by people on the right. People care about jobs and their taxes instead. Of course, what did the Conservatives do over the past few years? They changed the voting system without any referendum, without
true,
any
yeah.
consultation for mayoral and PCC elections.
So you explain they changed them
Yeah.
from proportional to a first past the post system.
Basically, yeah, before people used to be able to cast a second preference. So if your first didn't have enough support, then your second choice would be taken instead. And what that allowed in practice really was for people to vote pretty much always for who they fully supported. So that, for example, a Green voter might put Green 1 and then Sadiq Khan 2 in London. Those people now, it's basically a two-horse race really for all these elections. And I think that is why, for example, you've seen during this election, Sadiq Khan's team, panicking because they think Green and Lib Dem voters would have perhaps cost them the election. You see this sort of mentality, but also asking Green and Lib Dem voters to lend Labour their votes, which they appear to have done. But it does mean voters, they do turn up at the ballot box and they have to think very tactically, strategically, and sometimes hold their nose to vote for who they don't exactly want to support.
But you make a very, very good point. I remember the AV campaign debate over that in 2011. Dominic Cummings came to the fore. That was his big thing, along with Matthew Elliott. And they say you can't change the voting system. But the Tories have set this precedent. They have unilaterally in their own parliament got rid of fixed-term parliaments. Just on that aspect, another element we've been looking at Vote Watch is data trawling. We must point out not only Liz Truss share a platform with the co-founder of Cambridge Analytica, famous for data trawling and micro-targeting and bots and all that.
Steve Bannon.
Sorry, I think I've got to get to the end of who that person was. He was advisor to Boris Johnson and actually met up with the Foreign Office, Cambridge Analytica advisor.
And Donald Trump's chief strategist.
So those kind of tactics we've seen online, a lot of bots, some dirty data scores, explain a bit what's going on with all these weird polls online, Josiah.
Yeah, Adam's covered a fair bit of this as well, but you do see these sort of surveys from your local Conservative representative. Once you get about 20 questions in, you realise, hang on, I think this might be not just a usual questionnaire from a pollster, but, we are seeing these sorts of tactics. I do think part of it is they've massively upped the spending limit, for example, for elections in the UK. They actually doubled the spending limit for local and mayoral elections about a month to go before the elections began. Again, one of these precedents of not really consulting with anyone else before ramming through these sorts of changes. But we were talking earlier about it being a test run for the general election. Well, we will see a lot more of these sorts of tactics. We'll see parties employing very expensive, perhaps foreign consultants and big expensive PR firms, really with an understanding to get as much information and data on the voters as possible.
For micro-targeting, to get suppressing, to get them out the vote. As a Conservative voter lives in that street, you can then go and knock on their door, make sure they vote. Is that right?
I think you're talking about surveys, these surveys in that. They actually took it to an extreme in London with these leaflets that they sent out, these driving, which looked identical to penalty notices. Terrifying pensioners in parts of London coming through the door. It said driving charge notice, and there was a QR code on there saying if you want to avoid paying a penalty, you have to scan this QR code. And that took you through to a petition, a Conservative website, which is not clearly labelled as a Conservative website. And this is now being looked at by the Information Commissioner's Office.
I think, did you complain? Well, somebody complained.
Somebody complained after we reported on it. Yeah. And that's particularly worrying because that's just outright lies.
Well, you're alarming people. You're impersonating official notice, aren't you?
And the Sadiq Khan team have put in a complaint to try to get a police investigation into that.
Investigation?
I'm not sure that's actually going to happen, but these kinds of tactics, it's kind of an extension of what we saw in the Brexit referendum.
Absolutely.
When there was if you just keep on repeating the same lie, then it has an impact. It doesn't seem to have worked in London.
But that's the interesting
thing.
It's
obviously on a much smaller scale than what we saw during Brexit.
Though it's a drive-on. And let's remember, because I was part of the case against Cambridge Analytica, the great Facebook hack. I was hacked by this. It was called This Is Your Digital Life, 2015. If a friend of yours answered this questionnaire, all their friends' data got taken away by Cambridge Analytica and downloaded, and they could micro-target. Facebook don't do that anymore. But they have had some weird groups. They're better at sort of accounting for the political. But a lot of people, including Susan Hall's support, have been caught out in these weird groups on Facebook, haven't they?
They have, yeah. And they were only discovered quite late in the day in the election. With about a week to go, I think The Guardian unveiled that basically every single London borough had one of these Croydon against the ultra-low emission zone, Sadiq Khan's clean air charge. And they had one almost identically named for every borough. Of course, who were the people who were running these groups? Almost entirely Conservative activists and staffers, not clearly labelled as being run by the Conservatives at all. But of course, when you get groups like this, often known as astroturfing campaigns, you also get some people with some quite quite horrendous views take part in them as well. And so we saw Conservative MPs and Susan Hall herself actually sitting alongside in these groups, people who were posting those horrendous racist comments about Sadiq Khan and others, and calling for supporting vandalism against the ultra-low emission zone cameras. So yeah, quite strange bedfellows indeed.
And it goes beyond that. I mean, one of the leading figures in the anti-ULEZ campaigns was actually repeatedly met in person by Susan Hall and campaigned alongside her. One event in the final week before polling day, she brought her battle bus, complete with journalists on board, to come and meet one of the leaders of one of these anti-ULEZ campaign. And of course, we went through his social media
and you exposed it. Big scoop.
And found some pretty extreme racist and Islamophobic comments that he had made. But this has been well publicised. This has all been seen before. He's a prominent figure in the anti-ULEZ movement. His opinions were well known. But the Conservative Party and Susan Hall didn't seem to mind and were quite happy to be associated with him and to literally embrace him on the eve of the election.
Wow.
You talked about, Adam, the Information Commissioner's Office, which is relating to data and those leaflets. But it'd be interesting to explore a little bit about our electoral rules more generally. I mean, as you say, you have these leaflets which are presented as penalty notices. A lot of these other leaflets presenting as newspapers or almost Labour leaflets with red all over them, but just very small print with the Conservative Party labelled at the bottom. But I guess people would want to know if outright lies or extremely misleading campaign material is being put out there, what can actually be done about this beyond just a narrow interpretation of data harvesting and data laws? Because surely that is such a big thing, and yet we never really hear much about it at all.
No, we don't. And actually part of this is that the laws are pretty threadbare, it has to be said.
So you can so the leaflet itself that looks like a penalty notice.
I think that is under investigation now by the Information Commissioner's Office. So hopefully we should find fairly soon. I mean, where the laws actually are strongest in terms of electoral wrongdoing are actually when it comes to things like data protection, data rights, because we've had these things derived from the EU, like GDPR over the past few years, that do offer some quite strong protections for voters. But it's not been through any intent from political parties to say, okay, we need to safeguard democracy and the rights of voters. It's been incidental to that.
So it's how people's data is potentially being misused rather than the fact that you can present something which is very misleading and might give people...
on that.
There's no law certainly against lying in political literature. That's been repeatedly knocked down, often quite amusingly by the government when people propose laws in Parliament saying, we should really do something about lying in politics. The government says, no, that wouldn't be, that would be completely inappropriate. So we do get the odd set piece like that. But yeah, we often hear on social media from voters who are concerned about the things they get through their letterbox or they see on social media. And often we have to say, look, you can say something to the Electoral Commission, but frankly, it's been pretty gutted over the past few years. I mean, the government has literally through the Elections Act withdrawn its power to launch criminal prosecutions. We've seen the government be able to appoint more members to the body that's actually scrutinising the Electoral Commission. They can now set its strategy. That's now written by the government, of course, setting a pretty worrying precedent. This was all raised at the time. This claims of a power grab against our elections watchdog. And actually, it does seem a little bit like that. Those warnings have, come to fruition.
I'm just going to ask, what has the Labour Party said about all of these changes and these discrepancies? I mean, if they were in power, would they tighten up the rules? Would they introduce a law against lying in politics?
I think that's unlikely. Yeah, I think turkeys are looking pretty unlikely to vote for Christmas. But I think there will need to be a reckoning when it comes to things like the standards in public life, the things that are said in politics, the propriety of our election campaigns. I mean, Labour have been pretty quiet when it comes to discussing what they do in terms of repealing some of this legislation. They criticise things like voter ID. They criticise the Electoral Commission changes when it was going through, but they haven't actually said, okay, we're going to repeal this. Now, of course, they might do, but we just don't know that yet. So I think it's a bit of a wait and see, really, when it comes to this.
Just as one indicator, obviously, a very full programme of things for Labour potentially to do or things to overturn. Haven't they changed the rule, Adam, about lying in Parliament? So actually, it is now, there is some, and I think Labour want to make the Nolan principles, integrity, not lying, stronger, more enforceable. But I thought there's some change in the Speaker had said about Hansard has to correct the record or something.
I think that's always been the case, that you have to correct the record. And certainly in the ministerial code, you have to correct the record and that's what ultimately did for Boris Johnson, because he refused to do so.
And that, interestingly, just on the Electoral Commission, having the powers of investigation taken away from them because they were criminally investigating Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and the Vote Leave campaign. Okay, we talked about social media. Should we just have a step back and look at the actual results themselves and talk about the wider media, our friends in the island? We never speak ill of them. In the BBC, in the Murdoch papers, they're our friends.
The Evening Standard.
The Evening Standard. All these lovely people, we like them. But we are journalists and like to hold them to account as they would only expect. If you arrived on Thursday night, watched a bit of coverage before you went to bed at 11 or something, if you're an early bird, what would you have thought was the biggest surging party, the most important new party that had arrived on the scene on Thursday night?
Well, I think you're touching on probably the dog that didn't bark, actually. Reform UK, who just countless hours, actually, of coverage and interviews in the run-up to the election. And then you look at the councillor number tallies when you see them on the ticker along the live news broadcast, and you realise, oh, hang on, they've got 0 seats. Or I think it's 2 seats, isn't it?
Two.
Yeah.
They've gone up 200%.
I was being unkind. I think that's infinity percent.
Infinity, you're right,
it?
actually. My vote.
You compare that to the Green Party, who have got 181 seats.
181
And you
seats.
compare the amount of coverage that the Green Party has got during this process and the Reform have got.
I've seen the headlines from the BBC. Richard Tice, the millionaire property developer who speaks against elites and rich people.
And unlike Reform, I think there's a very good chance that the Green Party are going to translate this increase in support in local elections into a general election. There are now a number of areas where they're starting to become competitive in. They've currently got 1 seat in Parliament, likely to at least get 2, I think.
Caroline Lucas in Brighton, who's unfortunately stepping down.
I've got a question for you, Peter. You're our media maestro.
Yeah.
How does one explain that? How does one explain? Because I think Richard Tice, who's the leader of Reform UK, he was on Question Time.
Isn't there a permanent chair for him, or Nigel Farage? Isn't there a permanent chair on
Farage
Question
hasn't
Time?
been on in a while, but Tice was
really?
on recently. And how does one explain why so much focus is given to, as Adam and Josiah say, a minority party, which is 2 councillors in the country? Is it purely because of the speculation about the influence that Reform might have on the Conservative Party, the votes it might snatch away, or in your experience?
It's very interesting.
What is going on?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. And Adam and Josiah, yourself might have just as good an answer. Certainly in my lifetime, it's a long one, I told you I've got an over 60s rail card, so I know what I'm talking about. In the 80s, and the 70s and 80s, I do remember, it was always about rebellions on the left or the centre, right? So I remember early 80s, the Gang of Four, the SDP, Shirley Williams, Jenkins, David Owen, forming this. It was endless. In fact, I read a play about it, one of my early plays, second play about, media speculation. I had this media figure called Raymond Monday, and he was trapped in this world of making politics happen. And so at that time, it was all about centrist party. In the 70s, a lot about the left. And I do think there's a media bubble around certain politicians. We know that Tice's partner is quite a well-known journalist, allegedly.
Isabel Oakeshott.
Allegedly that she's a journalist, not they're in a relationship. And Farage has been very much a media-created figure. His fun, his good copy. He has the great virtue he's never had power. Russia Today used to film every intervention he'd make every few months in the European Parliament, make a big deal about it. He's great, a bit like Trump. They're great copy. And if you're a journalist who inevitably is working on the right wing of the media, what's your game? How do you get Conservatives to pay attention to you? Well, I've got somebody worse. I've got somebody to the right of you. I think there's some dynamic like that for 15 years, which is very much part of the media, especially in the press, the media landscape being to the right. Rupert Murdoch will play Nigel Farage off David Cameron to keep him scared. What do you think, Anna?
They are a media creation and literally part. I mean, they've got presenting jobs
Yes, that's right.
on GB News and elsewhere. It is a media creation. It's not about actually winning seats. Nigel Farage has been very successful politically in terms of the Brexit vote and in terms of the amount of attention he's got for his politics and in pushing the Conservative Party to the right. But he's never won a seat in Parliament. I think he's lost 7 elections, I think it is. And Reform are highly unlikely to win any seats in the general election. They won 2 councillors across the entire country yesterday.
Yet the BBC's headline, obviously quoting Tice, "We are now the main opposition to Labour."
I mean, it's just simply untrue, as we can see from the results. The main opposition to a Labour government is probably going to be the Conservatives. But the main opposition to winning anti-Conservative votes at the moment is the Lib Dems and it is the Greens. It is not Reform.
Yeah, very.
And actually, I think a lot of this is about media figures trying to effectively create stories, create hype. And I think the sort of legacy of UKIP surge, there is a feeling that, well, that must translate into support for reform. But actually, Reform's performance in this week's local elections has been far lower than what they've actually been polling. Whereas you see the Greens get very little coverage whatsoever, polling about, 6-7% nationally, but outperforming that in many parts of the country. In fact, Adam touched on the Greens perhaps winning a couple more seats in the general election. The Greens now control 14 out of 14 councillor posts in the Bristol Central constituency, which they're trying to win from Labour at the next election. So very few outlets will be talking about that, but it bodes very well for them.
And they're actually a real political party with a ground operation.
Whereas Reform is a private company.
It's a private company.
Owned by Nigel Farage, who's not standing.
It's like a kind of virtual party. It doesn't really exist in the way that the Green Party exists and the Liberal Democrats exist.
It's interesting about Bristol. There have been some emphasis on the Green Party, hasn't there, in Oldham and other parts of, particularly the north, with a big Muslim population doing well, and also the Workers' Party. I think got George Galloway, that charming man, got 2 seats. Has this been a big factor? Just to explain to people, there has been disappointment for many people in Muslim areas who supported Labour, that Labour have been tame on calling a ceasefire in Gaza, seem to be supporting the Israeli government over the Palestinians. Is this a big factor, or is it a temporary thing?
I think Keir Starmer's initial response to events in Gaza was quite weak, actually, and I think he could have taken a more nuanced position at the time. And I think particularly his comments in one interview, which suggested that Israel had a right to cut off water from Gaza, went down incredibly badly in not just in Muslim communities, but among many people across the country. And it does seem to have had an impact in the elections. I think from Labour's perspective, where it's had an impact has tended to be in areas where Labour are incredibly strong already.
Right.
So they've gone backwards in communities where they tend to be very safe seats. So I think it's unlikely to make an impact at the general election. However, I think it does point towards potential problems for the party further down the line in government. And not just among Muslim voters. We'll see what happens with that and whether the party can win back Muslim voters. But I think also just on the left, I think once Labour is in government, there are going to be people on the left, younger voters, who are going to be looking for things to change and who are going to end up being quite disappointed with Labour government not going as far as they would like on certain issues. We've seen Starmer rowing back in some areas.
Well, we've seen Galloway, who we've sometimes had some run-ins with in some of our coverage of his electioneering he wasn't too happy with. He's been quite prominent. Galloway, who is old school, was in the Labour Party, got expelled by Blair. It's quite prominent. And also Novara, a fellow independent media company. We like them, but they're slightly more politically aligned than we are, interviewing him. And Owen Jones saying, don't vote Labour, is creating you can see already in embryo, can't you, a kind of form of opposition, especially around the issue of Gaza. And
yes, and I think where that split is going to happen is actually with the Green Party. I think that's the most likely. Galloway's a bit of a strange one in that he's often painted as being on the hard left. He's almost going to the hard right.
His mates with Steve Bannon. He hugged Steve Bannon when Theresa May got
in interviews that he's done recently, he's talked a lot anti-gay sentiment, hard right, anti-immigration.
Yes.
He's on GP News quite a lot.
We used to be on Russia Today permanently.
Yeah, I think there's always been an element of that with his politics, but he's definitely kind of leaning into that at the moment.
Yeah.
Can we talk a bit about media in London? Labour's Sadiq Khan's won a 3rd term as London mayor, but there was a lot of speculation rife on social media and from correspondents at the BBC that the mayoral election in the capital was much, much closer. Adam, can you unpick a little bit about some of the narratives that were emerging and why you think that was the case?
So it's always very hard to poll mayoral elections, and there was YouGov, who actually previously had quite a good record in London, did put out some opinion polls suggesting that Sadiq Khan would win by something like 22 points. I think he's won by about 11 points. The worry in the Sadiq Khan team was that there was going to be a complacency and that people wouldn't bother to turn out to vote for him. So they've been saying right from the start. In fact, I went to Sadiq Khan's campaign launch, and I think in his speech at the beginning, he said this is going to be the closest ever election. So they stuck to that position all along. I think what changed in the last 24 hours is that we had these quite amateurish briefings from the Conservative Party and the Susan Hall campaign. In fact, one of the briefings that was being repeated by journalists was that they were utterly convinced that Susan Hall had won the London mayoral election.
But at this point, by the way, the ballot box had not been opened to be counted.
They've been verified, but there've been a few samples of some boxes, but there'd been no actual counting of the votes. And I think when you've got both campaigns saying this is going to be closer than the polls suggest, which it was, I think it's fine.
But of some polls, just it's 10 points.
Some polls. I think one
20
poll,
points.
Savanta were broadly, I think,
I mean,
online.
Lord
But
Kuenssberg said it was very, very much closer.
the way you
10%
report it
is
is to
still
say,
not close.
yes, both sides are saying it's going to be close, but we have to wait and see. And here's the evidence to suggest that it
And also
won't be.
source it. There was a sense that this was a fact. It is clear,
But
unfortunately.
there is an element of political journalism in this country, and I think the BBC sometimes falls foul of this as well, where they just repeat what is said to them wholesale from briefings and from largely WhatsApp. They get something on their phone and just repeat it wholesale without interrogating it and without doing the groundwork.
It's really interesting, the WhatsApp thing. Is that because they want to be first? Because if you query it, you'll get the scoop. It's, I'm hearing, by the way, and this also happened, do you remember, about Johnson getting 100 votes for coming back on the leadership? And that was removed by Chris
so
Mason.
there were a lot of people getting briefings from Conservative sources at CCHQ and at Susan Hall's campaign saying, we think we've got this. We've done really well with our voters. ULEZ is going to win it for us, etc., etc. And it just simply wasn't the case. Actually, Sadiq Khan's vote has gone up significantly, not just in London, but right across the capital. In Uxbridge, actually, where I think ULEZ did have an impact at the Uxbridge by-election last year, and the party suffered because of that. That was prior to ULEZ being implemented. Sadiq Khan's vote actually went up in these mayoral elections. So I think as a political journalist, you have to interrogate some of these briefings. It's fine to pass on what these sources are saying, but you shouldn't just repeat it as fact without interrogating it.
And should you source it? Yeah.
And can we look a little bit at the London Evening Standard, which is kind of the capital's local newspaper? I mean, traditionally...
Which capital? Moscow's or...
Well-
this capital.
well,
Sorry, it's owned by it used to be owned by
by-
Alexander Lebedev, former KGB station
But it's
chief in London.
a free sheet that's handed out, been through many iterations over the years. Adam, can you take us through a little bit about how did the paper position itself politically during the campaign, especially in the last week? And what does that tell us, again, about the more structural forces which underpin the political media coverage that we get?
I think the Evening Standard tells us a lot about how media has changed, not just in London, I think across the country. The first mayoral election that I covered was in 2008.
You must have been a lad then.
I was. And and back then, it was a major force and it had a real impact on the campaign under their then correspondent, Andrew Gilligan. They led essentially a campaign against Ken Livingstone.
Who's the government advisor still? Andrew Gilligan is paid by the government.
He is, yes, accusing Ken Livingstone of cronyism.
Cronyism?
Which is ironic given that the paper then went on to back Boris Johnson, who's
And invite him to their villas in Umbria.
But they had a huge readership back then,
Right.
and a paid readership. They then got taken over by Alexander Lebedev and Evgeny Lebedev.
That year, wasn't it? It was 2008 or...
It was around that time,
Yeah.
2009, I think it was.
Right.
And became a free sheet. And their audience has gradually reduced now. It's a fraction of what it was back then. Their influence has also completely reduced. They backed Boris Johnson in both of the London mayoral elections that he won. Since then, they've backed the Conservative candidate.
Back two losers. Three
Back to-
losers.
in the final week, it looked like they were going to back the Conservative candidate. They had a whole paper devoted to attacking Khan on crime. I understand there was something of a spat with City Hall over this edition. And 2 days later, they then gave a begrudging endorsement of Khan. It's the first time they've backed Khan.
Before the election, right?
Day before the election.
missed that.
But you
But
blink
what
and
people-
you'd miss it
Yeah,
because it wasn't on the front page. It was kind of
How
buried.
interesting.
But even this notion of a spat, again,
Yeah.
looking at the workings of media and politics and what we
Yes.
at Byline Times, our analysis is the media political class, of which there's been a merger. So there's a spat going on between the editors of Evening Standard and City Hall, and just unpick that a little bit more.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're London's only paper and you're covering what happens in London City Hall, you do need to have a working relationship with the mayor. And it is all about access. And I think had they endorsed Susan Hall, I think there would have been sort of implied threats about access to City Hall, I'm sure. I'm just speculating.
So that's just on behalf of City Hall is also not ideal, is it? That City Hall is operating within the system, which is about bartering
Yes.
and
And
access.
access, yeah.
But it's,
Yes. But actually, in reality, we're not where we are in 2008, where an endorsement from the Evening Standard can make a real difference because people don't read it. I'm sure you've seen at train stations the sort of piles of unpicked up copies.
It's absorbent paper, which
and
is great.
people, now that Wi-Fi is on much of the tube, people just don't read the Evening Standard in the way that they once did.
I think it's now shifting about the same number of copies as the
Byline
Daily Mirror,
Times.
which is certainly not the Byline Times, the Daily Mirror, which people actually have to pay for. So its influence has diminished a lot. And there was an incredibly embarrassing interview actually in the week where they endorsed Sadiq Khan, where the actual editor, Dylan Jones, said he never, in quotes, never reads a printed newspaper. So even its editor apparently never reads it.
Who used to edit GQ. I mean, this might be a good point because we've only got about 10 minutes left to see what lessons this teaches us for the looming general election. I don't know if it... First, Adam, does this make the next general election any closer or further away or the same? There's no imminent sign of a rebellion, the 1922 club, 50 letters going in or anything like that.
Well, I don't think there is at the moment, and we'll see what happens over the coming days. It's possible that people within the cabinet decide that they want to push, and someone like Penny Mordaunt decides that she wants to have a go, and that happens. It doesn't look likely at the moment.
Houchin was they were relying on that Northeast, the man who built these wonderful free ports at a very cheap price. I don't quite understand what went on there, but maybe worth looking at some of the allegations Private Eye have made. He's got back in, so they're hanging on that. But they briefed it to such extent, they thought they'd lose 500 seats. They've lost 500 seats, and all the local councils were around about that. They kind of falsely briefed they'd win the London Mayoral.
Yeah, it's amateur hour, really.
Yeah.
I mean, the expectation from management in London in particular was dreadful, saying that they were utterly convinced they were going to win when they were nowhere near.
But it doesn't affect the timing of the next general election.
Timing of the election, I think if you were Rishi Sunak, you'd be absolutely mad to go for a summer election. I think the only hope he's got is just to hang around and hope that something changes.
Oh, God, this makes it so difficult for us.
There's some scandal. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it dragged all the way out to December.
Oh, God, Adam.
But I think the only chance of it being earlier is if there is some kind of push against him.
That's his sort of veto threat, his nuclear option. If you try to get rid of me, I'll go for election.
But I think most Conservative MPs are just kind of accepting that the game's up.
And they're sort of resigning.
And they believe that if they did go against him, that it would actually just make matters worse for them.
So, Hadi, what does this tell you about the future? One, to me, is that the papers will Murdoch back, courtship with Starmer like he did with Blair, and first Blair throughout in 1994 to Hayward Island, they backed him in 1997, and then Rebecca Brooks didn't back Gordon Brown, she backed Cameron in 2010, and they went horse riding together. Huge deal because she was friends with Gordon Brown's wife and all that shenanigans. Who cares now who the Sun backs? That's good news, is it? Do we even know? The Sun political correspondent has made a complete fool of herself by saying that Sadiq was not going to win the election. The Telegraph, do we care? Is there any chance the Telegraph might back Starmer? No. Do the papers matter anymore? I mean, do the other papers matter anymore?
Do the other papers matter anymore? It's really interesting, isn't it? Because their answer to our argument that they have too much influence is, well, our circulations are going down. So why would tens of thousands of copies sold of our newspapers and magazines affect anything to do with politics? And our analysis of Byline Times is always that's not the relationship that matters. It's not about the newspapers and the magazines and the public. It's actually about the newspapers and the magazines and the people in positions of power. That's where the levers
Maybe
are.
explain that a little bit. That was the editor of the Spectator saying that to you, I remember, on the media show or Radio 4. And what the previous...
Why would we have any influence on the
And
public? Only tens of thousands of copies of a
His
Spectator
predecessor
report.
became what? Prime Minister, I think, maybe? Yeah.
And his political editor, I believe, was Rishi Sunak's best man and now works for him on a policy basis.
Oh, and I think their commissioning editor is Dominic Cummings' partner.
Yeah, so there's a lot
But they have no power. Hadi, they have no power.
Well, exactly,
They're just
but there's
like us.
this merger. But I think something is starting to change. So that merger is very apparent. But the merger has been for a number of years between, I would say, right-leaning outlets and conservative politicians. And that's sort of worked quite well for the last 14 years in which both have been in power, so to speak. I think that's going to change now because, as Adam was saying at the start of this podcast, the country's in a different place. I really think that. And I don't think the culture war tactics, the cruelty, or the newspapers and any of the headlines that they can conjure up, which, again, are pretty outrageous. Just one very recent example, a Daily Mail front page with a picture of a Holocaust memorial which was covered up. They claimed that the Met Police had covered it up because of the protests in support of Palestinians, and it wasn't the police at all. It was quite standard procedure, and it said the police are covering up the Holocaust. That is such a major thing. I don't think the public are...
It demeans the value
It demeans the value. But I also think at the stage people are at now, like Adam saying, people's mortgages have gone up, the NHS doesn't work, all this stuff. I think you're
trains.
less vulnerable to looking at the headlines. So I think there is a sea change that is happening. I think what would be really positive is if there is a Labour government, they might be fierce enough to have a look at some media reform. But I think that there is a change. I think their influence is
I mean,
waning.
you can see that in the polling. There's some interesting polling recently, which shows that Labour have a lead among Daily Telegraph readers, among Sun readers, among GB News viewers. In fact, the only publication it seems that the Conservatives still have a quite narrow lead is the
Russia
Daily
Today.
Mail.
Oh, Daily Mail.
So these publications quite clearly don't have the influence that they once had.
And it will be interesting, I think, to see how that plays out with the general election, because you often hear from newspapers and their editors that, we don't lead our readers. You hear from media observers that they don't lead the readers. They follow what their readers
They listen
think.
to
Yeah. So, okay, will GB News now be shifting to a much more pro-Labour stance now that their viewership is backing the Labour Party? I think it will be interesting when it comes to the election. But as you say, will people be looking at the endorsements of the Telegraph and the Daily Mail in the way they used to? Perhaps not.
And Peter, just on a completely unrelated note, which I think regular readers of Byline Times will appreciate, I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that the Hollywood actor Kevin Spacey gave an interview to Dan Wootton. But this is completely unrelated. But I just wanted to say it because I'm still trying to process Kevin Spacey talking to Dan Wootton.
I think he may need some media advice.
Allegations of sexual impropriety. I'm still trying to work that out. But as I said,
I was
this is
going to say
completely
Dan who?
unrelated.
Dan who? Dan who? I don't know. I do know Kevin Spacey, and
Do you? What?
not personally.
Well, I don't know.
I do know
you?
who he is. No, I met him once actually, but briefly in the bar downstairs, the Young Vic. Yeah, so we're looking forward to those dark arts going on. It doesn't seem like they are taking root, but it gives us a lot of work to keep our eyes on it. I am just thinking about the time. We better wrap up now. So my final thoughts are, I am celebrating. That's why probably my thoughts are fading a bit, because we've had lots of late nights, and now this rather nice pink Prosecco has just hit my head. The British people do amaze me. And I will say that I celebrated the fact that Theresa May won the leadership over Boris Johnson, right? And Andrea Leadsom. Why? Because I thought, though she's Conservative, I didn't agree with Brexit, she might do a better job, definitely, than Boris Johnson. And I rued the day when he took over the leadership, because what it would do to the Conservative Party, let alone to democracy. So I think we can celebrate, without being party political, the triumph of truth over lies, of people going and getting their marriage certificates over voting suppression, and the Evening Standard being absorbent. What's your final thoughts on this and what it bodes for the next election, Josiah?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how the Conservative Party reacts, because I think in the face of growing evidence that they are completely out of touch with the public, they seem to just increasingly lurch to the right. We were talking before this started about the Uxbridge by-election a year or so ago, when the Conservatives narrowly won, and that led to a big shift in climate and green policy from the government. Now, Sadiq Khan's just increased his majority, his support in Uxbridge. Will that now lead Rishi Sunak to reverse some of those reversals and shift dramatically towards pro-adaptation to climate change policy as well? I think probably not. I think probably they'll just listen to their right flank and possibly go down to the spiral of doom.
And I think on a similar note, I think there's a lesson potentially for the Labour Party and Keir Starmer there. Sadiq Khan pushed ahead with ULEZ despite huge opposition, not just from the Conservative Party, not just from much of the press, but also from the Labour leadership. Keir Starmer, before the Uxbridge by-election, came out against the policy. He pushed ahead with it because he believed it was the right idea. He believed that children in London, their lungs were being stunted, that people were breathing dirty air. He pushed ahead with that policy despite people warning that he could not win a third term. He stuck to his principles on that, and he's been completely vindicated. His vote has gone up from 2021. And I think there's a lesson for Keir Starmer there. I think when he came under similar pressure from the press and from the Conservative Party on his £28 billion Green pledge, he ultimately folded on that. I didn't believe at the time that he should have done. I don't believe he needed to. And I think sometimes in politics you do need to take a principled stand, and you do need to stick to what you believe in. And ultimately, I think when voters see you doing that, I think you can be rewarded for it.
Adi?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting year. I think we're going to have, in the run-up to the general election, a lot more of these tactics that we are documenting through our Vote Watch project. We're going to see a lot more of that playing out. It concerns me. I think there is some positivity in that the public is rejecting the tactics. I'm not talking about which political party is the master of those tactics. I'm saying they're rejecting the tactics of division and racially motivated rhetoric and all that sort of thing. But what worries me within all of this is that you do have these leaflets that are looking like penalty notices. You do have people who are not mentioning the Conservative Party on any of their campaigning material and trying to get votes. You do have a former deputy chair of the Conservative Party saying that the Muslim London mayor, who represents Labour, has handed the city to Islamists. Yeah. There is something, and I think that is going to continue these sorts of tactics in the run to the general election. And even if the general election does see a change of government, I feel like there's an undercurrent here that we always need to be on our guard with, and we can't get complacent about it, because it is alarming that these sort of tactics are being used. Brexit unleashed them, and I think they're going to run. And I think it's going to be a really interesting era in politics, not only because the government might change and we might get some improvements in some areas, it could also unleash some quite extreme politics in other areas. And I think, it'd be really interesting. And just on that note, I mean, Vote Watch is our major project for this year at Byline Times. We're really, really grateful for everybody who is chipping in to help fund it. Our only motivation is to catalogue all of these instances in which we feel democracy is potentially being warped. And we'll keep doing that from an independent stance. And so if anyone's interested, please go to our website. There's a Vote Watch investigations tab, and send in any concerns or things that you see, because journalism at its best is being the eyes and ears of the public. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not serving any master apart from our readers and the public and democracy.
And in that, we are very much dependent on you, your support for our newspaper, your subscriptions. There's a form that Josiah set up, your tracking of voter suppression techniques and dirty data and dodgy techniques. These go back, of course, as we first documented, to Brexit, where xenophobia, data gathering, and all these dark arts came to the fore. But before then, the dark arts of the newspaper. And hopefully, knowledge is inoculation. Daylight is the best disinfectant. We'll be disinfecting and shining torches in these dark corners for the next few months ahead. And meanwhile, from the clean air of central London, our studio in Southwark, thank you very much, Josiah.
Thanks very much.
And you, Adam, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And Hardeep, thank you.
Thank you. Adam used to juggle.
I was going to say that.
I'm sorry, Adam.
I know, we just discovered. Exclusive, breaking news.
That's our scoop today.
Adam Bienkov is a secret juggler. And on that news, we have to close the show. And we look very much forward to, we'll have some cameras there next time. You'll be able to see Adam juggling. And we will do more regular shows on this spot, Byline Times Live, and also put it out on podcasts. Thanks for listening, and speak to you again very, very soon.